If I could comment, it's very important, that last point that Professor Patnaik made. I'd like to build on it, because in that remark, he grasps what I think is the core remarkable phenomena here in the United States, which is exactly the feeling. I wish I remembered his exact words, but the feeling that his words conveyed, that the system doesn't work. Masses of Americans are now able to say that. They are able to take the step beyond, I can't get quite the job I want, or I haven't got quite the income I need, or I can't afford to get married, or I can't afford to have children, or fill in the blank. There's a whole, and those feelings, which are, by the way, quite realistic, have come together to give them something which I thought would take much longer, which is, and I say this with all the hesitancy, of someone who had to be persuaded of what I'm about to say. There is now an awareness that I had never seen in the United States in my life, that the problem is systemic. It isn't this or that. It is a whole. And not only is it systemic, but the acceptable word is capitalism. You can say it's a systemic problem and it's capitalism. Capitalism has now become part of the humor of the American people. We are making jokes. Our leading comedians, who have never shown any political awareness at all, are now finding it convenient to make a joke where the butt of the joke, the point of the joke, is a capitalist who's doing something bad, or a capitalist who's very stupid, or a capitalist who makes one mistake after another. In other words, it's the humor which gives you a feeling that the level of alienation is enormous from this system. It is not cultivating loyalty to itself. On the contrary, if I had to say what enabled Mr. Mamdani to be as successful as he is, and I should mention, I do not know him. I have no personal relationship with him. I admire the work of his father, who is a professor at Columbia University here, and who wrote what I consider to be the best book on the colonization and colonial economy of East Africa that exists. He is the son, therefore, of something very interesting that goes way beyond what he says in public. Fathers and sons are different, so who knows? But I will tell you that his vote is a vote that he was able to get, and no disrespect to him at all, because he was able to present himself as the embodiment of every younger person's alienation, and a good deal of older person's alienation too. He is fresh, new, young, coming to maybe give us a change. And people are so alienated from the Republican and Democratic parties alike that he's in this remarkable situation where he actually may win despite the hostility of the banks and the big businesses and all the usual enemies of this way of thinking. Well, I guess I have to answer by saying it's all of those things, that everything you just said is a very good opening list of where to start thinking about this. I should explain, I am sitting in Manhattan, in the core center of New York City. I voted for Zoran Mamdani myself because it's part of where I live, and he's the candidate of the Democratic Party for the mayor of the city of New York. He won the election to be the Democratic candidate. He still has to stand against others in other parties, not the Democratic Party, in November of this year when the formal election takes place. Normally, in the politics of New York, if you win the Democratic nomination, you win the election because the Democratic Party is by far the dominant political party in this city, and it's been that way for quite a while. Uh, that's the framework. To respond to your question, and to say it in all honesty, we in this country are slowly and hesitantly emerging from 75 years of relentless propaganda and relentless repression of anything and everything having to do with socialism. In my case, I speak personally because that has been my life. But I was born in the United States. I've lived here most of the last 75 years, and that has been my experience without exception. Whether it's the media or the political speech of the leaders or the statements and speech of business community leaders, academics, it doesn't really matter. The forms vary, but the message was very well coordinated. You know, I'm a product of the elite education of this country. I went to Harvard, I went to Stanford, and I went to Yale. That's not the place where you usually produce a socialist, but they produced me. And part of the reason was I was in a constant state of opposition. Every class, every professor was an opportunity for me to learn what was to emerge as my own view about capitalism and socialism. Everyone tried to persuade me and my teachers of the superiority of capitalism and the hopeless dead end, which is how they described socialism. But they did not succeed. And part of that, and now part of my answer, is that they never quite extinguished the movement for socialism. They tried, and they went very far. And for many, many Americans, and this is crucial that our friends in India and everywhere else understand, for the mass of people, they made socialism into an absurd caricature, a place of dictatorship, a place of no democracy at all, a place of suffering and poverty and misery, unrelenting. And that's true of the New York Times, and it's true of rural newspapers, everywhere the same. However, again, there was always resistance, and there were always places you could go. So in my case, I found my way to Harry Magdoff and Paul Sweezy. And those were Americans with whom I could talk and who could teach me, which they did. And they were very self-conscious in teaching me and quite a few others. Even while we were in Harvard, Stanford, Yale, or wherever we went to school, how we could develop a critical consciousness. But we are the exceptions. Everything has changed for us in the last 10, 15 years. Again, I need to underscore that. From having no audience, our audience is now counted in the millions. It's a very heady experience for me because I'm alive to see it and to feel it and to participate. Harry Magdoff isn't. Paul Sweezy isn't. My teacher at Stanford, Paul Baran, isn't. And the others like them. They died, they passed on, but we are here And we are experiencing, and it has to say so, a resurgence of criticism of capitalism and interest, serious interest in socialism as a better alternative. Having said that, I need to add, but it is a feeling, not an understanding. The knowledge of socialism here is, I'll be as polite as I know how, primitive, very primitive. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. I would say over the last 75 years, 90% of what the socialists of the world have been debating and discussing and arguing about and developing is unknown in the United States. They simply don't know. Unless by some fluke they have had to go abroad or become involved in a person from another country who takes them to the literature of that other society, they just don't know. Most Americans only speak English, only read English, and look at the rest of the world as a secondary backdrop to what happens in the great world of the United States, with an occasional look at London or something like that. It's very parochial, and when it comes to socialism, very, very backward. All right, now, with that framework, one last point. In those cases now where socialism is engaged, and I want to be respectful to the millions of Americans who are now willing to think about socialism, who don't simply dismiss it the way we were taught to do for 75 years. They don't. And that's an enormous breakthrough. And if I had to give anyone credit for it, it would be, believe it or not, Bernie Sanders. His willingness not to reject the socialist label in a public way opened a space that has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger ever since. No longer needs him, has momentum of its own. But there's very little understanding of the range of difference among socialists as that has evolved. Very little understanding, so that Mr. Mamdani, and by the way, a second person, a socialist, who may well become the next mayor of Minneapolis, an important city in the middle of the country, who's also a socialist, and quite a few other socialists in various places getting elected in big elections. Those people are what you would understand as the socialists for whom socialism is mostly about governmental activity, and governmental activity displacing or replacing private capitalist activity, or regulating capitalism in one way or another. And if you look at the programs, that's what they advocate. They advocate, the government should help people with housing, or the government should help people with, but you can almost write the sentence, the government should help people, and then finish it with 27 different specifics, and that captures what they mean. By the way, this does not mean that these candidates don't, in fact, have greater objectives, more social transformation objectives. They may have them, and that's important, but it cannot be spoken. They will not speak it because their fear is that would immediately take them over the edge back to the silencing that they suffered before. Sorry to take so long, but I wanted to give you some sense of both the good news and the distance we have to go. Again, I'm struck by the parallels in the way Professor Patnaik is looking at this and the way that I do too. And I feel validated a little bit by hearing this. Let me pick up on this thought. Here in the United States, we may actually have a dialectic in Hegel's original sense of it, working in the other way. There is in the United States a pretty clear understanding that the period after World War II can be described, as I describe it all the time publicly, but I can do that because it's accepted, that the period after World War II can be described as the undoing of the New Deal. The New Deal was the name given in the 30s by the Roosevelt administration to its very social democratic program. Just to remind everyone, the Great Depression of the 1929 saw the American working class sharply move to the left. It gave rise to a powerful communist party, two socialist parties, and the greatest labor union organizing drive in American history that brought millions for the first time into organized labor unions. And it all got capped off in World War II with the United States allied with the Soviet Union. But it was for the ruling class a shock that they never recovered from because they were made to pay for it. Taxes were raised on them very sharply, and what the government didn't get in taxes, it took in forced loans. So the government took it all and gave Social Security and unemployment compensation and 15 million public service jobs, things we have never had again. Unbelievable. The whole 20th century is really the collapse. That's the first third. And then, and here comes Professor Patnaik's remark, rollback, the post-World War II taking it all away, which literally culminates in Trump, who is simply the last or the most recent and perhaps in some way most extreme, both in what it does and in the verbiage with which it does it. But that creates dialectically the following argument that I and people like me can make in the United States, and which it is my hope the Mamdanis being elected, that they will make this the following argument. In the 1930s, there was a great debate between the socialists and the communists, reform or revolution, in the old sense of Rosa Luxemburg and all the others. And that struggle was won by the reformists, and the revolutionaries were defeated. And they even, with a few exceptions, went along with the following deal. We will support Mr. Roosevelt for president, but he has to be a social democrat. He has to pass Social Security, unemployment compensation, a minimum wage for the first time, incredible program, which he did. That deal was made. And the reformists won. And then I look across the audience and I say to a group of Americans who are nodding because they understand it, I said, then, because you didn't make a revolution, you left in the hands of the capitalists the profits, and now with your social democracy, the incentive to use the profits to roll back the impingement on their profitability, which is what they did, starting in 1946 and without stopping the whole way, right up until Mr. Trump. And then I pull the punch. I say, so now we have history teaching us that we shouldn't be debating reform versus revolution. The trick is to understand that you focus on reforms while teaching that the only way to secure a reform is to make the revolution. And that argument, which was so difficult 50 years ago, is now occurring to people in the street. And that's the magic of this moment, which we are all hoping stays here and matures and develops. My response would be similar. I would say this, that in many ways, the Chinese model, what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics, is a combination of state and private capitalism that has demonstrated that it can grow faster over a longer period of time than any private capitalism can do. This reality is now shaking to its core the United States as a society. It has to come to terms with the reality I just articulated, and it cannot do so. It can't admit it. It can't face it. It can't do anything other than try to slow it, repress it, stop it, deprive it, attack it, whatever. And the only disagreement is how best to do that, not whether to do that, at least for the moment. That's the effort to undertake it. And it seems to me that there's a lesson there. And I think the lesson will be learned here in the United States, perhaps not in my lifetime, but it's coming. And it's the old lesson. If you can't beat them, join them. That what we will see in the United States and Western Europe is a copying of what has happened in China, differently organized, but it will be an attempt, if I can paraphrase what Professor Patnaik said, it will be an attempt to get the advantages of a mixed system, but with the private more dominant over the state than the other way around, for all the obvious reasons that would be at least the ideal of a progressive capitalist politician who offers that as a way out of the dead end that they're now in. And in order to make that happen, or to maybe put it differently, in order to plan on how to answer that question, which socialists will have to respond to if I'm right about where it's going, then socialists have to have something to say about the last point Professor Patnaik made, where he said almost at the end of his sentence, with the state sector somehow dominant. Is that where we're going? Is it that socialism will be the mixture with the state part dominant, and what we used to call capitalism will be a mixture with the private part dominant? Is that the juxtaposition that we're looking at? Or, which I would prefer, to go the next step and to say, no, we really do mean a transformation of the workplace to put the working people in charge. Right there, not just at the high levels of government and politics and parliament, but in each workplace, it becomes a democratic community of the people at the workplace who decide collectively and democratically what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product. That, for me, then becomes a clear revolutionary step beyond any and all combinations of state and private. I would only add, if I could, somewhere Marx writes that no system disappears until it has tried every conceivable form in which to survive. And in my reading, socialism and capitalism do not have a boundary that is clear and fixed and firm. It is very fuzzy. And what the final stages are of a capitalism trying desperately to hold on in one form or another, and where socialism begins, I think those things overlap, and that it is productive to keep that in mind when looking at the United States flailing around in its desperation. And this morning's headlines, just to give you an idea of how crazy it is. In this morning's headline, President Trump has accused former President Obama of treason, which is a crime punishable by death under American law. I mean, and that's just a sign of how bad the breakdowns of society here are. But I think that our difficulty in looking at China and weighing the positive, the worrisome, and all of that, that's the boundary that's fuzzy. And we should appreciate that it's that boundary, because it gives you a way of understanding what the direction of change likely is. In my understanding of Marxism's complex studies of the state, I like the old idea, which I think goes back at least to Lenin, that the state is the executive committee of the ruling class. And for me, therefore, it follows that all the states, forms of state that have emerged out of the collapse of feudalism and the last 5 centuries of capitalism spreading to cover the globe the way it does now, that what we have seen is the complicated development over time, the evolutionary development of a state apparatus appropriate, as much as they could do it, to the needs of capitalism. If we are able to build the community Professor Patnaik talks about, workers at the workplace becoming their own employer, so that the class difference between master, slave, lord, serf, employer, employee is finally over, that kind of a reorganization at the base will have to work out for itself the state forms, central, decentralized, and so on, that reproduce that system, just the way capitalism has made use of parliament, dictator, as it needed it for its own survival and its own development. But we should not be held back in our thinking and planning and imagination as if we had to pick among the forms of capitalism the kind of central or decentralized state apparatus that we are going to have in a socialist system. And there I would end only with a quotation from a man from whom I learned a great deal. Louis Althusser, the French communist philosopher, had an idea about ideological state apparatuses. And he didn't develop this part of the idea, although he spoke to some of us. I spent some time with him. He spoke to us about it. And one of the things he said was to understand that out of a different class structure comes a wholly different role for ideology, so it isn't anymore a state apparatus. That was a very liberatory idea for all of us, and it's really that I'm working on a little bit as I respond to your question. Is a screaming comment on the Starmer government and on the conservatives that went before. What a disaster that place has become. It's even worse because Had he done it, had he raised the tariffs either uniformly or if he wanted to vary them differently and then stuck with it, it would be one thing. But to do what he did and then to bounce around, to delay them, to make them temporary, to change them up or down with Canada, with Mexico, on and on, the creation of a layer of enormous uncertainty. And let me explain why that's so crucial. Business person after business person that I've spoken to says to me, and it's, by the way, well known in the literature, that uncertainty is the biggest enemy of an investment program. The problem is not it's profitable. The problem is really what's the probability that it will be profitable. And you can't normally calculate that very well, but when you have oscillating policy, it makes it only worse. So let me say in simple English, if you're a businessman or woman and you're contemplating moving production, say from Shanghai to Cincinnati, you know it's going to take time, it's going to take a lot of money, it's going to disrupt everything that you do and relationships that you have. If the profit difference of staying versus moving is large, and the probability that that will endure is large and won't change a lot, if that probability is also large, then you might do it. But they aren't large enough. Otherwise, see, if you're the vice president who makes the decision, and then you arrive in the United States to set up your company, to move your business from Shanghai to Cincinnati, you don't know how long Mr. Trump will keep the tariffs in. Will he raise them? Will he lower them? Will that happen under him? Will it happen under his successor? Moving a factory or anything like that is a multi-year operation at enormous cost. They're not going to make those decisions, those costly decisions, when Mr. Trump has not only shown them, as Sean has just listed, all the reasons why not to do it, but he's also added the layer of uncertainty, which makes it even more unlikely that you're going to see meaningful movement. You may see promises that we will invest $500 billion in the next decade, but that can work out and that cannot work out. And everybody who's involved in this knows that story only too well. Well, I group all of these as symptoms of a declining empire. I think, and I become more convinced of this almost with every day's headlines, every day's breakthroughs in revealing what's going on. This is the end. You've had a century of the Pax Americana, the globalization, the transformation in a very Hegelian dialectical way of the little colony of Britain, fights a war, becomes independent, and eventually transforms the colonizer into the colonized and vice versa. The US and Britain exchange positions or change roles. And the British Empire is at the end of its long decline. The United States is a much earlier stage, but it's a stage of that decline. When the different parts of the decline provoke reactions that are intended to slow the decline, but are overwhelmed by the whole process, and so they worsen what they're supposed to alleviate. And I think we're seeing that. That's why I picked the example of the electric vehicle, because here's a tariff designed to protect American jobs. It doesn't do that. It has perversely the opposite effect. You know, keeps us wedded to fossil fuels. That's not where the world is going. keeps us low. But I was in Paris a few weeks ago. The taxi cabs are BYD. You know, what's going on? The Europeans are having debates about how to win investment from China. All right, so you can see they're trying to solve their problems by enhancing the economic well-being of the Chinese, who will, of course, use that then in developing themselves. They are the rising new phenomena. I don't think it's clear yet whether they're going to create a comparable empire to the British and the American, or whether they're going to actually try to develop a multilateral system. That was the dream of the League of Nations after the horrors of World War I. And it was again the dream of the United Nations after the horrors of World War II. Maybe the Chinese are going to be the agent that gets beyond sequential empire to a multinational way of coping with the problems of a modern world. The technology to coordinate is there. The political will to do so isn't there yet. And the role of the Chinese is probably going to be to decide how to go and therefore take the world with it. It'll be hard for the financiers because that's what they are. They live in the world of moving money around, and long ago lost interest in, knowledge of, and any incentive to keep much track of the underlying production. Here is, in a way to put it. When Britain becomes the engine of the world economy, and the beginnings and the power behind Britain taking over the world in the empire, it is a country that is pouring investment into the production of textiles, the production of iron and steel implements, the production of shipping that uses iron and steel, and so on. It is heavily devoted to doing the latest, best, heaviest production possible in the world of goods. The United States, both before World War I and particularly after that or after the Depression, is likewise pouring money into production. The railroads, the infrastructure, the steel mills, the ironworks, all of it. And then, this is so crucial, and it's crucial economically and ideologically. Starting around the 1970s, American industrial capitalists had an epiphany. Two things overwhelmed them. Number one, the internet and all that it represents. And number two, jet engine travel. Suddenly, you could keep tabs, you could supervise a factory in China as easily as you could 50 miles away in a neighboring US state. And likewise, in a few hours, you could be there if you had to be on the ground to solve a problem. It suddenly meant, and this is the way they saw it, and I'm not saying they had to see it this way, but this is the way they saw it. We can make much more money, more profit, if we move production over there to where the wages are a small fraction of what they have become here in the United States or in Western Europe because of generations of class struggle in which the working class pushed up their wages against the fierce opposition of the capitalists, but an opposition that they eventually overcame, at least to a considerable extent. And no sooner did the early capitalists who were willing to take the risk, close the factory in Chicago, open it in Tianjin, and solve all of the problems of such a move, and there are many. It became clear that even when you add the cost of shipping all that stuff back to the United States, it was still profitable, which meant that all the competitors who are American, of the American companies that go first, have to do it too. And you suddenly have, over the last 75 years, but particularly the last 50, 70 to now, you have a mass profit-driven exodus of American industry over to China. I mean, to India, to Brazil, but mainly to China. And the problem ideologically is no one had a gun to their heads. They did that voluntarily to pursue profits, to generate a tremendous boom in the American stock market since the 1980s that reflected all of that. And in order to be critical, you have to say who the culprit was. It wasn't the government. It wasn't the labor unions. It was corporations who were already profitable, who were beginning to suffer the competition of the returned German and Japanese capitalists, but who nonetheless made a decision to deindustrialize the United States, the way that Europeans are doing it now, because they can't afford the high prices of education that their own sanctions against Russia brought on themselves. So don't be surprised if a system makes decisions that bring onto itself an evolution about which they later become very unhappy. That's what you have now. That's why it's important to blame China, as if they are the ones who made all this happen. You know, I was born in the United States. I've lived and worked here all my life. And so my lifetime happens to coincide with the Cold War after World War II, whose legacy is still with us. And here's what I would say. I think we are headed like a runaway train going down a very fast track, heading straight for a stone wall. I do expect there will be a crash. Of course, I can't tell you exactly how or exactly when. No one can. But all the conditions, whether it's an overvalued stock market or it's all the comments and analyses that Sean and I have tried to summarize here, that's what I see coming. And that makes me wonder whether or not we may be in for a kind of rerun of the last time American capitalism crashed in the 1920s and the end of 1920s and the 1930s. At that time, the American people went sharply, the working class, to the left. It supported a communist party, two socialist parties, and the greatest labor union organizing drive in American history, the greatest one before or since that time. And I would not be surprised at all if the reaction of the American working class is, we have been neoliberal supporters and it didn't work for us. And then we tried the right wing, Mr. Trump and the MAGA, and it didn't work for us. We will now try the left. And whether it's Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or now